Thank you for having me. Masi Cho, Ganashish, Kwena. I appreciate actually something that happened right at the beginning, which was to acknowledge the traditional territory, the West Coast Salish. So that's something that we like to do up in the north, recognizing that all of the land which we inhabit up there is some piece of traditional territory. Okay, this has been a bit of a whirlwind for me, so bear with me if I'm stumbling a little bit. I have a complete bias. I love where I live. I live in the north out of choice. It's a beautiful place. It's a place that resonates with me, and I sense that a lot of people love where they live, and I think it builds into our choices about how we work in the world, in how we exist with it. I need to give you at least a little bit of context about what's happening with climate change in the north, just to give you a sense. Let's not do that. Let's do that. Okay. In the late 70s, early 80s, we started to get messages from hunters and elders, from Inuit and Sami people, that there was a problem with sea ice, that something was going wrong with sea ice. This picture just shows sort of the seasonal minimum of sea ice from 1979. The reason that it's 79 is because that's the first year that we had satellites up to take a picture, so we can get a composite picture of what sea ice looks like at that time. So the first 20 years or so, we don't know whether that's a big year or a low year. We just sort of took a look at it to try and see what's going on. And for the first 20 years, we took an average. We thought we saw a downward trend, but it wasn't all that staggering. There was a downward trend. This is 2005. I'll just play that back and forth for a second, so you get a sense. By 2005, we'd lost 20%. That's the spatial extent, the area of the sea ice. It doesn't yet tell you about the thickness. And this is, I would argue, the single most obvious, visible representation of climate change on the planet. It is obvious. You can see it. It's happening. This is 2007. Again, just playing them back and forth a little bit. We lost another 20% in 2007. Last year, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its massive report, it still was saying at that point, you know, it's an assessment report. It takes time. Academics need to review the material in order to try and give it its validity. And at that time, we were still saying 50 to 100 years before we melted out the Arctic. We're now saying we'll probably lose the North Pole in summertime, probably within the next 5 years. So our conservative type of estimates, in this case anyway, are far too conservative. So the changes that we are feeling in the north are obvious, strong, faster than we've seen. The people of the north generally are resilient. Alain was saying that there's 4.5 million people in Costa Rica. Well, that's how many people we have in the Arctic total. And in the Canadian Arctic, 100,000, 120,000. So I'm going to give you a couple of stories about climate change as it's been felt and how people have been responding. But I'll give them to you more as stories. The first one, we don't, in the north, sure, we've got lots of science types, as Hassan referred to us yesterday as boffins. I don't know if you have that British background, but we've got that type, and we do all the graphs, but we keep them in the background. The way in which we relate with the people is we have to move to the human context and put faces on it. It's very important for us that the way we see people and how we interact with them is at that human level. I was on a teaching expedition from Iceland to Greenland to Baffin Island, and my story's going to come from Baffin Island. I'm sorry, I didn't have slides with me. I had started to travel when I first spoke with Deborah, trying to find someone for her to speak here. This is just a shot from Greenland, some kids, and we moved across to Pangertung, which is a small community on Baffin Island. And there we met with an elder. His name is an Inuk elder. His name is Jonasi Karpik. This is not a picture of Jonasi. I'm sorry, I don't have one with me. But we sat down to talk with Jonasi. Now, Pangertung is on a bay. Of course, every community up in the high north is on water. And that bay freezes up and thaws every year. And he was talking to us in Inuktitut, and we had someone translating for us, and we were all sitting there listening to him, and he was talking about how the bay had melted out. Typically it melts end of June, early July, and that year it had gone out in March. Now, that bay represents how people access food, how they move around, how their fundamental cultural base. So this is not a small change. This is a sweeping change. And they were just figuring out how they were going to respond to this. So it's interesting to note, this is us sort of sailing away right after Pangatung, and we were just taking a picture of an iceberg. And I found out 6 months later from reviewing, again, sort of the snow and ice shots, that right at the moment while we were discussing this with Johannesy, a big chunk of the Ailes ice shelf broke off that month and disintegrated. So the change is happening very rapidly. Just this year in Pangatung, what happened was a flash flood came down through the community, and the river, which carries that water out, carved down through the permafrost, went down through 10 meters of permafrost during that flood event, and took out 2 bridges, separating the community from its wastewater facilities and its freshwater drinking facilities. It was, so those types of realities are there. When we talk about adaptation, of course you're adapting to that. I mean, how can you not? You must, right? And that's a necessity. But the thing that Johannesy talked to me about, like when I asked him, so we're having the conversation, I said, so what should we do? What would you ask for us to do for you in assistance? And he made a signal with his hand, and he was talking about writing about it. There's a phrase or a term in Inuktitut called sila, or the word is sila. It means weather, for one thing, or climate, but culturally words don't translate that well across from one language to the next. It also means outsiders, or the external, or the metaphysical, what is outside there, and it's kind of an interesting metaphor about what we're trying to do here. Yes, we want to deal with this issue, but we also, it has these external repercussions, and I'm going to come back to those at the end of this short talk, very short talk, Joanna. So he asked me to write about it, which I did, and I published a letter, and so I love when I get invited to these types of meetings, because I'm then invited to tell this story. So what he's saying is that we still require quite a bit of public education, and it's going to come back to the point of responsibility at the very end of this presentation. Well, I'm going to give you one more story about a climate change impact. This is that very first slide that I showed you was a picture actually of my wife standing out on New Year's Day on our lake. This is another picture of our lake from last year. We had a major flooding event. In fact, we flooded higher than we've ever flooded before. And you can start to see our adaptation there on the side. We're there putting in a bunch of blocks and sandbags. The flood was caused, if you like, at least partly by natural variation, but the variability is going up with climate change. We have a great deal of melt happening with our glaciers. I see Amber Church sitting over there. I know that she's done research in this neck of the woods about what's happening with the glacier next door to the one that would feed this one. And I believe she told me at one point that it's been reduced by 40%. Broadly, I know from my work with NASA that we're reducing that whole ice field quite rapidly. And so you've got more melt. We also happen to have a very hot summer that year. Okay, so you bring that melt down quickly, and finally we had some major rain events which we don't typically have. So those 3 things come together, and you get a little bit extra flooding, but of course the damage in flooding is that little bit extra. So it becomes an issue when you start to think about climate change and how we're going to deal with it. If we designed our systems to work within a fairly stable climate and we move outside of that threshold, we've got to rethink how that works. So again, to put the human face on it, this is my